Hello and welcome back. I'm Erica and we have with us Jeff, Mason, and Cameron today. And today we're going to talk about using languages and stories, both using real languages and how you go about creating a language if you're in a fantasy or other secondary world setting. So I just want to turn this over to the group. What are your thoughts on using other languages in fiction in general?
You better know what you're doing. Sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying so many thoughts. It's involved, right? I know when I first started, I was like, oh, you make up words and you italicize them. That shows that there was another group that came before and creates age. And honestly, like I say it in jest, but that still totally works for me. Like I'll read something with a couple of italicized words, I'm like, woo, tell me more. So I mean, I do feel like you can do the iceberg effect. You can do a little bit. And not really shoot yourself too much in the foot. It was just kind of like a handful of words that are maybe known or known by a particular person in the story or a group of people in the story. And then that's it, right? And so that feels kind of like a way to dip your toes in without overcommitting and then making a ton of mistakes. So I would say that, like I said, I sort of mocked it as I said it. I do it definitely, but I think it is one way to go about it in a safer way.
Yeah. Sorry, Cameron, you were going to say something just really quick. I think the eternal touchstone when we talk about languages is Tolkien, right? Everyone talks about Tolkien, and anyone who's out there creating a language will point to him as justification for doing so. And then people who don't create languages either find some reason to like maybe write off what he was doing a little bit, or B, maybe like feel insecure as a result of, or just like, see, that dude's crazy, I never want to compete with him, right? I think it is important, really quick, just to kind of like cut that conversation off at the pass. Tolkien, as I understand him, was a world builder first and an author second, right? As we like learn about his life story time and time again, that seems to be the situation, right? And that worked out for him, which is excellent. But I think everyone, when they're making a language, the question needs to be asked: are you an author first and a world builder second, or a world builder first and an author second, right? And if you're the latter, what are your expectations? Because if you just want to build this world for yourself, that is awesome. And I can say from personal experience, tremendously fulfilling, right? But probably not the most like financially rewarding if what we're looking for is publication, right? And if you're an author first and a world builder second, what is drafting up 10 languages doing for you that outlining a book couldn't maybe do a little bit more efficiently?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a little different if you're already a linguistics expert, right? And you sort of know the rules of language building and whatever, and you can apply some of those rules. But I absolutely agree with Mason. At a certain point, it's diminishing returns. You can get the same sense of icebergness of the world that Jeff was talking about without having to create from whole cloth 100, 1,000, 10,000 words of a new language. I feel like the middle road that a lot of folks take, that I've tried to do when I'm messing with other languages in my other worlds, is crib from existing languages in our world that are either narrowly spoken or maybe dead languages. You do have to be really careful, because you know you're going to run into somebody who really cares about that language, and you're going to get some stuff wrong, and you got to be prepared to deal with that. But I feel like for the vast majority of readers, you can get a lot of bang for your buck that way. And you don't want to necessarily lift wholesale unless it makes sense to do so, but at least use an existing language is your guiding star for what words should sound like, what names should sound like, what letters go together and which ones don't.
Just to
Yeah, Cameron brings up a really good point, and I want to just quickly reiterate a point that I used in our previous video on fantasy naming or just character naming creation, that you cannot make up a combination of syllables that does not already exist in some language somewhere. So even if you're not using a source language, you're going to make up something and it's going to mean something in a foreign language. So anytime I make up a word, I just Google translate it to see if it means something somewhere. And if it means a simple word that isn't going to be weird or stupid or mean out of context, then go ahead and use it. But make sure you're not cussing people out in Portuguese or whatever it is you're using.
That's such an amazing point. Agreed. One thing that I heard that I thought was a good advice was you can take 2 languages or 3 languages and then create fusions of words. So like if you decide, oh, I'll draw from these 2 languages, what is each of their language? What's their word for fire? And then you use like the front half of the first language, second half of the other. Obviously, that's not going to be necessarily linguistically correct, right? But it does allow you to create words that are unique or different, and yet have some consistency to it because you're drawing from more than one source. So that was a pretty cool advice. I've yet to fully put it into play, but I probably should.
Yeah, kind of pinging off of that. I'm currently working on a fantasy series that fantasy novel that takes a fair amount of inspiration from Nordic nations, right? Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland. And so a fair amount of the time when I am kind of devising whether it is like a god's name or some like oh gosh, proper noun, right? Just inventing a proper noun whole cloth that is either like a magical thing or a god's name or like a place and things like that. Oftentimes look at like the Norse nations languages and then maybe like take bits and pieces here and there so that it kind of evokes that feeling, using the little bits and pieces here and there. I do think it is important to say that there is a lot of responsibility in the appropriation of these languages, not just in the sense of like, oh, let's not cuss someone out in Portuguese, but also a fair amount of the time, kind of throughout the history of fantasy, like Middle Eastern kind of Arabic languages and like the principles of those have been used in like kind of exotic cultures or in evil cultures in fantasy novels, in order to like, because there is kind of that otherism affiliated in like Anglo-Saxon culture, I suppose. And so people sometimes in a quick effort to kind of evoke that foreignness will otherize actual current languages. That's bad, right? To basically utilize like real world harmful stereotypes for your languages and the characterization of the cultures that use them, that's not great. Yeah, so I think maybe that kind of puts a bit of onus on like making sure that the cultures that you are creating, if you are using kind of real world languages, which odds are on some level, whether consciously or unconsciously, you will be, make sure that those cultures are not entirely evil or irredeemable, right? And try not to just kind of make them a pastiche or a caricature of the bad things, quote unquote, of real world cultures.
Going off Mason's point, my giant pet peeve in any fiction that uses real languages is Dora Spanish. And Dora works just great for what it's designed to do. It's a language learning tool for preschoolers. And so Dora will only speak the Spanish words, or if you're watching it in a foreign country, she speaks other languages. she only uses the Spanish words that a child can figure out in context or would know from background knowledge. And I see a lot of fictional characters who will throw out the words for yes or no, or hello, goodbye, or swear words and insults or terms of affection. And you don't absolutely need to know what she's saying to her boyfriend in French, but you can tell the way she's saying it, it's a term of endearment. And maybe people do this with terms of endearment and swearing, but the first words you learn when you're studying another languages are yes and no and hello and goodbye. So I've never had a friend from another country who reverts to those words when they're speaking English to me if they've studied English for a long time. And when people do that, they're doing it for the audience's benefit of having this character give them a glimpse of the exotic, but then they're completely fluent at all of their times. They're not making grammar errors. They're not using the syntax of their first language. They only have that language for flavoring. And that always falls short because even if you don't speak another language, you have friends who do this, and you know people don't do this.
I do agree, but I think there's a lot to potentially talk about there in terms of figuring out swear words, right? So that's one thing, and obviously that's not even just a book thing, but TV shows. I mean, we can look at like Firefly, for instance, where you've got them using Chinese swearing, right, to show that there's been this mix of English and Chinese. And so that creates this effect, right? Or even in what Battlestar Galactica with like Frak, you know? So like finding those words that are similar. And the reason I thought about it was because I have some friends who are Polish from my time in New York, and they would slip into like Polish swearing. Especially, I think there's certain words that also are satisfying to say. And so they would often swear in Polish as opposed to, you know, English. So I think there can be some of that. Obviously, they were second generation, so there can, you know, be differences. And I'm not saying this is representative of all peoples, but I think we are writing that line, right? You know, you want to write a book that maybe is more YA, for instance, and so you don't want to have traditional swearing in it, but you want that feel of swearing. And so it's like, how do you create that? And I think we see a lot of people finding ways to do that, some more effective than others. So just talking about that.
Yeah, to that point, I think it was only a couple years ago that I realized that like reading Harry Potter in like the UK and reading Harry Potter in the United States likely is a very different experience, right? And I don't think that our friends in the United Kingdom's probably minded as much the foul language that was being utilized. But in the US, I know a fair number of people who were just like, oh, it's not swearing, right? Because it's using the derogatory terminology of some other culture, and as a result doesn't have the same maybe meaning to us, right? So it is super interesting how like a fair number of YA authors, I don't think it's entirely bad, but effectively kind of like appropriates these terms from other people so that they can kind of evoke that emotional feeling without actually offending audiences, right?
All right, does anybody have any other thoughts they'd like to share about languages?
Well, I did just, when you mentioned Harry Potter, I did just want to say, I think there is something fascinating behind when you read just the slang that other cultures will have. I feel like that creates that extra sense of fantasy. I feel like one reason why Harry Potter can evoke a lot of that fantasy is because for us in the US, reading a UK slang, you know, it feels different, you know? And so it creates a lot of what we're talking about just naturally by being popular in another area. So, you know, there is that kind of thing to consider, that you're writing. I don't know how much, it's so hard when you're in it. Like, does the US writing style of English sound otherworldly to someone else? I imagine some of our slang would, but a lot of that wasn't coming across. Like, she got to do it because she was writing urban fantasy, you know what I mean? Whereas if you're writing more traditional fantasy, you're not going to be using as much perhaps of that slang. I will say a book that I thought did a really, really nice job of kind of making its own terms and phrasing and feeling like its own, was a new book called The Black Tongue Thief that just came out, new fantasy book. So that I think is a good example of him really not using so much another language, but using our words, but in combinations and ways you don't expect. Or he will throw out like a weird little word, but then he'll like tell you what it means. And so it's an interesting play on language, and I've seen a lot of people commenting that they really liked that style from it. So I think that's a good example of very modern day fantasy. I'm not saying the story is modern day, but a book that just came out very recently and what it's doing. One last quick thing, beyond just coming up with languages, I think it's also important to think about when we're confronted with someone who doesn't know our language, or someone who knows part of our language, and sort of what those interactions are like and how that can be captured in unique ways. And I think Erica's story, for instance, where she's made up like her own country and you've got people speaking the language and not, I feel she's done a real nice job of, it's not like we get whole speeches in that language, but I feel the difference of the way certain people talk and that type of thing. So I think it's also about what sort of interactions do different languages lead to, and still showing those interactions. And that can be the really fun part about various languages and cultures coming together in the book.
Jeff, I love the point you bring up about world building in contemporary and urban fantasy settings, because, and Mason, you touched on this earlier, that in the battle of world building versus writing, you're always going to need it to make up something, even if it's just a geographical name or the names of a character. My genre that I love to read and I love to make fun of is modern Ruritanian romance, which is the genre that Princess Diaries is, where we're in the broader context of the modern world, but we've created this fictional country. And my pet peeve that I make fun of in a lot of Ruritanian stories is you'll see these monarchy countries that live in Europe somewhere, and they speak English for the benefit of not just American audiences, but American characters who go there so they can communicate with everybody. And you cannot have a monarchy in an English-speaking country if you don't have Queen Elizabeth, because the only countries that speak English are England and places that England has colonized. So they wouldn't have their own government system. So I'm working on a Ruritanian project right now, and that was something I was very conscious of in the beginning, that I wanted to have characters speaking in another language. I wanted to be ambiguous enough that I couldn't pin it down to one place in Europe, because that's a hallmark of the Ruritanian genre, that you never know where this country is and it's kept ambiguous. But I did want to feel like it was a real place, because I know this genre well enough to know what I like and what I want to see more of.
I was just gonna say, kind of as my little 2 bits here at the conclusion, right? I don't think that this is necessarily publishing advice, because I think that there are plenty of projects that are successful financially that don't do this. But maybe just more so kind of from like a personal ethics point of view. Just be careful, right? And be conscious and be compassionate as you are kind of like wading into other people's languages, right? When we utilize stuff that belongs to another's culture in the pursuit of creativity and creation, we are effectively kind of like either A, borrowing, or B, sometimes even just straight out stealing someone else's stuff that they care about a lot, right? And so I'd just say, like, be compassionate, try not to use a specific language to represent every single bad person, and also probably try not to use a language to represent every single good person either, because that brings with it a whole different set of issues. But yeah, I think it's just good for us to, try our best and keep the people whose stuff we're borrowing in mind.
I'm sorry I haven't contributed more to this conversation, but I've been stuck for the last 10 minutes thinking of all the swear words I know in other languages.
Cameron will now swear at us in Portuguese.
I should probably keep that in my head. So, languages, they're fun.
Languages.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, Blockheads.